Welcome to week 9 of the Open Agriculture Learning Series. My name is Doran Cox with FarmHack and FarmOS and Green Start, and the purpose of this series came out of a gathering of a State of the Soil meeting in California in February, and there's a real consensus that there are some benefits to bridging the gap between monitoring and sharing data, and bridging the communities between modelers and models and data on the ground. So we're now in week 9 of this learning series, and we're here to continue to develop an ongoing dialogue and discussion so that we can identify common barriers and points of collaboration. So I'm really excited to have Allison here with Field to Market, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Allison, to do an introduction and presentation, and we'll follow up with questions. And if you're following this, if you want to use the chat box for questions along the way, that'd be great. Thanks so much. Allison, it's all your show.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm happy to be here to talk a little bit more about what Field to Market is up to. So I've just a little bit of background about me so you know where I'm coming from. I joined Field to Market about 4 months ago, and previously I was with the University of Maryland, a research center run through the university with collaborations with Department of Energy's National Labs. So I come from an academic government research agency perspective, where I was doing a lot of modeling, doing climate impacts on crop yields and looking at climate mitigation policy and land use change in agriculture. So I come from this quantitative modeling background. And Field to Market, as I'll get into, is a much different type of organization. And I'm still getting to know it and getting to know what where it's engaging and sort of the power of the type of approach it's bringing to bear in agriculture. And so I'm going to share a presentation I have here. I'll get that started up for you all. And I'm going to go through a little bit of just overview of what Field to Market is, and then I'm going to talk more specifically about some of our metrics and an online calculator tool that we have that is used by a lot of producers and our members to look at sustainability and some of the ways that we handle the data from those projects, and so where we're headed as well, as this is still relatively new and scaling up, and so we're dealing with a lot of data and management issues related to that. So I'll get into that. So the motivation behind Field to Market, it's an alliance for sustainable agriculture, really motivated by all these issues that you are all familiar with, right? Which is just that the population is increasing, incomes are increasing, dietary preferences are changing. In addition, we have this challenge of changing climate that's challenging agriculture. And agriculture is using an enormous amount of resources on the planet. So how do we have agriculture become a more sustainable steward of the resources, as well as be able to meet the productivity challenges that are facing it? In addition to that, there are changing consumer tastes, right? Consumers are more and more conscious of sustainability and interested in understanding more the sustainability of what they're buying, from food to all sorts of other products. And so companies are, retail companies and so on, are trying to respond to that kind of consumer pressure as well, in addition to all the environmental concerns. So in response to that, a lot of organizations, some of you will have seen some of these claims, or objectives really is what they are, is that, Coca-Cola reducing their greenhouse gas emissions across their value chain, sustainably sourcing their key agricultural ingredients. All of these large companies are making these goals where they're stepping out and saying, we really want to sustainably source our product because we realize how important that is for the environment, but also for our consumers increasingly. And so one of the challenges that comes up when you have these big companies stepping out and saying, sustainably sourcing their raw agricultural materials, and you have a dozen large companies saying that, and they all develop a separate way to do it, you end up with a really unwieldy space, and it's very difficult to see how they're able to actually trace back through the full supply chain to know where their soybeans or their corn are coming from for their products. If they're just acting unilaterally. So this is where Field to Market was established about 7 or 8 years ago, with just a dozen groups around a table, really focused in 4 sectors, and we divide them into sectors within our membership. So we have grower organizations, like national grower organizations for the commodity crops. We have food and retail companies like Kellogg and Walmart. And we have agribusiness as well, and we have conservation groups. So those are the 4 sectors that are voting membership. We have a fifth sector that is ex officio, which is our partnership with USDA, as well as with universities, primarily through the extension programs. So we have, at this point in time, we've grown from the original 12 to about 75 members, and it continues to grow. And it was, until last year, it was an initiative of the Keystone Policy Center, and last year they spun it off, and now it's its own nonprofit 501c3 organization with a small staff here in Washington, D.C., managing this membership. And I was brought on, as I said, just a few months ago as the Science and Research Director to help guide development of the metrics that I'll talk about. And how I wanted to put this slide up here, how we actually define sustainable agriculture, because sustainability is one of those words with many different definitions. But in this context, treating it as meeting the needs of the present while improving ability of future generations to meet their own needs by increasing productivity, as well as improving environment, human health, and social and economic well-being of communities. And I wanted to mention our guiding principles as well, because I think this is important. Not all sustainability initiatives, I think, work in the same way, but these are the principles that are really important to our membership. And one is engaging the full supply chain, so going all the way from the grower producing the soybeans through to the retailer that's selling the finished product, using that as the primary input. And so that involves a number of different companies along the way, including the agribusinesses and other middle players in that space. So trying to really engage across that full spectrum so that there is some traceability for the commodity crop supply chain. It's somewhat unique, and it's a difficult challenge because it is these are treated as commodities in such a way that they're aggregated very early on. So purchasers of grain from certain regions of the country can't necessarily trace those back to specific watersheds or specific areas where they were grown, and they would like to start being able to do that. So Field to Market starts to provide a way to do that tracing back and connecting the links in the supply chain. I've highlighted a few that I think are really of relevance to this particular discussion. One is that the commitment is that it be science-based, and that's why my position was created, was to bring in somebody to help ensure that when we say these are science-based and we're evaluating them in that way, that there is objective evaluation of them. So part of my role is bringing in outside expertise to help evaluate our metrics and other activities to ensure the science-based criteria is being met. It's also, the next two kind of go together, being with outcomes-based and technology neutral. And what this means is that we're not going out with a checklist and asking producers to do certain activities, to adopt certain methods of production. We're saying what we care about is the water quality outcome or the greenhouse gas emissions, whether those are increasing or decreasing from your production. And so we're looking at those outcomes, and we're technology neutral in terms of we're looking for continuous improvement in those outcomes. But how you achieve those, that decision is with really the individual producers, because each farm, each region is going to be having their own issues, and they all own best ways, best management practices and things like that are most appropriate to their environmental situation and their other considerations. And so we're not specifying those things. Those are left to producers to decide, but to be building towards more sustainable outcomes that we're measuring with the metrics. Also, we have a commitment to individual grower data privacy. That's always important. So we are having individual growers enter information on individual fields, but that does get anonymized before it goes too far. So that it's not something, we're not reporting on individual farmers back up the supply chain. It gets aggregated to a project level. That'll become a little more clear as I go. Again, there's this emphasis on continuous improvement, and what that means is that we don't see sustainability as a defined endpoint, but as a process. So continuously looking for ways to improve performance based on these outcomes. And then we're measuring these broad scale trends, field scale outcomes. We work in three main areas. So one thing, I'm actually not going to talk about the National Indicators Report. The last one was released in 2012. It's available from our website. We'll be doing an update due out in 2016. You're welcome to take a look at the one on the website, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions. But what I wanted to focus on today was really the field printing process, so that the online calculator that we have, as well as supply chain projects, so how it works when we engage a group across the supply chain. And I want to just put this here, not necessarily to go through it all, but really this is the goal pledge that our all 75 members agreed to, which is improvement across these particular areas that are important. All of these have metrics associated with them that I'll get to. What I really wanted to point out here is the goal, the quantitative goal of seeking to engage 20% of productive acres of U.S. commodity crop production, which is equivalent to 50 million acres by 2020. So this is a big scaling up for us. I mentioned we're just, really starting to scale up. We've got about 1 million acres as of the last year. So this is really a doubling every year of our engagement. And so it's a pretty ambitious target, but there's a lot of signs that it's growing fast enough that we'll be on target for that. So there's a lot of potential for data and information coming into the program from that. Just to mention who's doing the work. So there's only 4 of us who are full-time staff, which is quadrupling over last year. So we've really staffed up. We do have 2 contractors who help out, as well as continued assistance from the Keystone Policy Center. They continue to engage with some facilitation assistance. We also have our members work together in these supply chain projects to organize and staff the field projects. So we as staff and contractors help with the field print projects, but they're really staffed by the organizations who are putting them together, by the member organizations. We also have a board of directors drawn from the 5 sectors, as well as 5 work groups that meet quite regularly on specific areas. Each one of those has co-chairs and a staff, as well as members drawn evenly from the different sectors. Since I've come on, I've become most familiar with the metrics work group here. But there are several others that are dealing in very quantitative issues, particularly, I'll mention a little bit about our verification work group that's developing ways to look at the aggregate information coming from the projects and verify sustainability claims and outcomes. All right. So what is the field print calculator? This is our main tool that we use to look at sustainability. It's online, so it's available from our website. There's a sample farm you can pull up and use, and any individual can go in and enter their own field, whether it be one you're farming or one you happen to have data on. You're welcome to go in and test it out, take a look. And it has within it 7 main metrics on the land use, soil conservation, basically soil erosion, soil carbon, for which we use the NRCS Soil Conditioning Index, water use from irrigation primarily, energy use on farm, greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, and then we have an 8th metric on biodiversity. It's a habitat potential index. It's not online. That's in a spreadsheet form being piloted right now. And the boundary for these metrics is within the farm gate up to the first point of sale. So it's pretty defined to what's happening in production on the farm. So it includes, for energy use, for example, it would include the energy use embodied in producing any fertilizer or other products you apply to the field. But once you've sold the commodity, it moves out of field print calculator domain. Growers, can enter their information and see their performance, and then they can compare their performance over time against their other fields as well, and with county, state, and national averages. So we have benchmark values based on USDA information that calculate these metrics for regional areas, so growers can kind of see where they stand within those categories. I wanted to mention a little about how the metrics were developed. They are independent of one another, so it's not a cohesive model. It's separate metrics developed for these specific areas, although some of them use the same information when gathered through the calculator. So this is where the working groups really have come in and said, you know, these are the metrics that we need, and building up, some of them being developed directly in-house, but others being contracted out through technical advisors or other contractors who help to develop them. And then really the full membership does, or the working groups do, particularly the metrics working group does decide on what the scope of the metric needs to be, and evaluates existing models and things like that to agree on the appropriate methodology for field to market goals. The criteria that are generally followed is that it does need to allow for a farmer-friendly interface. So it needs to be something where the burden of information gathering is not prohibitive on the producer who has to enter the information. I should say that a lot of the projects operate in a way that the extension officers or the crop advisors or the others who are helping directly engage the growers in the projects will develop a checklist, and they'll work with the farmer to enter the information. So it's usually not just the producer sitting down to do this. They usually have some assistance within the project to enter the information. The metrics also need to be linking practices to outcomes. So we need to look at being able to provide credit essentially, or if being realistically encompassing the suite of practices that growers are using to manage their sustainability in these various outcomes we talk about. So trying to be realistic as to what's actually happening on the ground, and making sure we incorporate the effects of those practices into the metrics in a meaningful way. Again, they're practice and technology neutral, and then they demonstrate the outcomes that are within a farmer's control. So a lot of this is things that can be influenced by the farmer's actions or choices. And then again, transparent and credible and based on publicly available data and methods. So the transparency is important. I've mentioned that we're scaling up and have been growing quite fast. And so one of the things we've just done is developed a standard procedure for developing metrics that includes independent expert reviews to bring an additional level of scrutiny to the science to make sure that we have independent evaluation, that the methods we're using are robust and credible to the scientific community, in addition to appropriate for the specific purposes of field to market. This is just a screenshot of the calculator online, just to show you the interface. So growers can log in, anybody can log in with an account, create an account, mark out where the field is that they're considering. The calculator will pull certain information based on that location in terms of soils and weather information. And then you enter a large amount of information based on your rotations, the crops you're growing, your various amendments, and then how you handle the harvest and things like that. So it all gets entered in through the web interface. And this slide shows sort of one view of the outcome. And so it's this spidergram looking at the blue area in the middle is this particular field, so where it falls in the various metrics, with the lines representing the benchmarks. So they can start to get just a visual picture of where they're, under, over performing in terms of sustainability compared to the national or state level. The national level benchmark I don't think is that useful to them, but the state level has been more influential. We're developing benchmarks at the crop reporting district level as well, so that will be a little bit more narrow in scope and relevant to the producers. Okay, so who's using this tool? As I mentioned, it's really accessible. I don't think there's that many people who just go use it for the fun of it. I think it's mostly used within the context of supply chain projects. And again, they enter information, often with support from the advisors or extension agents helping out with that particular project. So far, we have approximately 700 individual growers who've entered fields into it, so about 1 million acres of cropland so far have been entered in. And the objective is really for a lot of these, to get a sense of performance, you have to benchmark, not just compare to the benchmarks at the state level, but to look at the benchmark for your own field, which means establishing several years of data. So you can go back and enter previous years of information if you have that, or you need to be waiting and developing that benchmark over several years, and then be looking for improvements in areas where you see opportunity. So the projects primarily operate as supply chain partnerships. So that means various members of ours are working together to engage producers in a specific region, sometimes looking at a specific outcome, but often looking more at sustainability more holistically, and starting to engage the growers there in a conversation around their sustainability and around the actions they could take to improve their conservation outcomes, their sustainability. So a lot of it is starting to really engage producers in this and making sure that there's this communication from the ultimate consumer of their product all the way back to the producers. So there's two-way flow of information in terms of producers understanding why, what the ultimate consumers of their product are interested in, but also for those retail companies and everybody in between to understand more of the issues involved with achieving the sustainability outcomes and be more engaged in helping to identify solutions. So the sponsors can include grower organizations or other supply chain companies. Conservation organizations get involved. We have a strong partnership with NRCS. Some of our projects are also sponsored under the RCPP program as well, released recently. Currently, we have supply chain partnerships in 20 states. So this map shows the states we're engaged in as well as the crops in those states. So right now we're working with 6 commodity crops that you can see in the list there. We're adding alfalfa, I think in the very near future. It's almost there. So, and we're looking to add some additional commodity crops that are important in rotations in some of these regions. And so just one example that comes up is one of our larger projects. So 3 supply chain partners, Unilever, ADM, and WWF, are working with soybean growers in Iowa on a project. And where this one really, I think there's a good supply chain story with this one, simply because it's pretty clear. So Unilever was looking into their sourcing and found that they purchased all the soybean oil for Hellmann's mayonnaise from one particular plant in Iowa that's owned by ADM. So they're working with ADM and then WWF as well to identify the growers who are feeding into that particular mill. So it's essentially the mill shed of the soybean oil that they're sourcing, and really reaching out to the growers to establish the baseline of their sustainability performance, and to work with them to facilitate adoption, access to conservation practices, and monitor for this continuous improvement. And so this has been a relatively large project, I think, with about 150 individual growers who've participated with this. And so you start to see what some of the outcomes are. So this is just some example of some of the results coming through from this particular project. So looking at our water quality index, this is NRCS's WQI tool, and it's just showing, because what producers really respond to, what growers really respond to in this particular realm is really in terms of their yield. They it's the most important indicator to them of their sustainability as a farm how much are they producing? How much are they able to produce? And so this is really the point of this one, was just showing that there's not a strong correlation here. It's, improving your water quality does not mean reducing your yield, or vice versa. And then looking at this in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production. So we're looking here, we look at most of the metrics are in terms of efficiency in production terms. So instead of CO2 per acre, it's CO2 per bushel of production. So it's indexed essentially to how productive the farmer is. And so this is just looking at where the greenhouse gas emissions coming from. In this particular area, it's primarily tillage and field operations, and then crop protectant or chemical products, so the embodied emissions and production of those, as well as N2O emissions from fertilizer and manure, the main contributors. So it's not too surprising. It's useful to start to get a picture of where those are coming from, though. And this is from a separate project, but this is the type of feedback. So once there's been a project in the field and they've gathered information, the projects hold meetings and they bring their producers together and sort of talk to them about what's going on and what's important, and they can share back this type of information. You can see it's identified just by ID. So the growers will know their own ID, but they won't know who their neighbors are. But they can look at themselves on this chart and see where, again, this is in terms of CO2e per bushel. So they can look at, how efficient they are in these various components of greenhouse, activities that are producing greenhouse gas emissions. And I think this, from what I've heard, this has been a pretty powerful type of communication to them that really gets them thinking about, where there might be opportunities. It's just an interesting way to look at, how their neighbors are doing, and in a way that they don't necessarily have access to typically. So it's providing some value back to them. So again, as I mentioned, I know this is an important issue, that the data are made anonymous before reporting beyond the project manager level. So individual managers might see the data come in and can tie it back to producers, but they provide just IDs and scramble it so that we can't see that. Right now, again, as we've been growing fast, we haven't really had guidelines in place for central reporting and collection of information. So it's all available through the back end of the calculator, but it's not done in a way that we here right now have access to it easily. So we're establishing some guidelines just for how members who are running these projects are expected to report data back to Field to Market. So we have, so that I could give you, for example, more robust statistics on the actual number of acres engaged. We're doing rough numbers because we don't have access to the exact specifics. Some of it's in flux, but also just we need to get better information provided back to us. So we're setting that up. We're also establishing guidelines to how to ensure any claims are verifiable. So a lot of the member organizations would like to be able to start using their participation and their sponsorship of these projects to communicate to their shareholders or to consumers their engagement in sustainability efforts and their contribution to improved environmental outcomes. And to do that, there has to be a way for Field to Market independently to verify that what they're claiming is verifiable, that it's true and robust. And so we're establishing guidelines for how to do that. It's a relatively complex process, but we're getting there. And I mentioned earlier this objective of scaling up to 50 million acres, which is pretty ambitious. One thing that we think is essential to doing that is moving beyond the use of just a web interface tool and moving to incorporate our metrics into various API application programming interface platforms. So this would mean that including it within software that's used on precision ag equipment that farmers are already using. Those already collect a lot of the information that we use in the calculator. And so we're piloting with a couple of different platforms that our members have to really make it a lot easier to scale up the program, because the data will be collected automatically and it will just be a question of running an additional program through that and calculating our metrics from that, and make it a lot easier for the growers as well. We also use feedback from the projects to inform metric revisions, and this is a process I'm engaged in with the metrics work group, which is that a number of our metrics, we're looking at how they're performing and looking at where the science has come since they were decided upon, and making revisions and in some place replacements based on partly on feedback from the projects, but also on scientific input. We're also releasing a new version of the calculator next June is the target for that. So there's about a year from now, we'll have a version 3.0 technology for the calculator to be released. There's also a number of other sort of supply chain sustainability programs out there right now. And we're working to align with those, in particular, aligning our metrics with other programs. So we've got agreements with Sustainability Consortium, if you've heard of that, as well as Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. They're developing their own sustainability program and are going to be using our metrics for the on-farm production of feed part of that, but their own, of course, metrics for anything happening within the barn in terms of energy efficiency and water use and things and animal welfare. They're developing that part, but we'll align with the production of feed components. And our membership continues to grow. And we expect that to continue to happen, particularly as we bring in increasingly more, not just the food and retail companies and agribusiness, but we're reaching out more into the meat production sector as well. So getting into the feed growing part of commodity crop production to help scale up. And so I've mentioned this a couple times going through this goal that the membership has of being able to make statements or claims about their participation in field to market and what that means for improving sustainability. So what they're doing to be good stewards of the environment when they source their products. And so this is it's just still a very active discussion. There's a group that's been working very hard on this for the past several months and continue to do so. We've joined the iSeal Alliance, which is kind of a watcher of the watchers in terms of verifying these types of claims in the sustainability arena. And so we're looking at, particularly with commodity crops, so what scale of engagement do you need? What kind of sampling density would you need to be able to make a claim about a region or about a product that you're sourcing through a field print project? Another area obviously is that growers are retaining ownership of their information, but we're still working to develop a central repository. Ideally, we'd like to provide through the results of the calculator, not just your benchmarks for your own field and your state, but also other growers in your region. If we have enough information there and we're able to anonymize it, we can provide very specific feedback in terms of your relation to other producers in a similar area working producing the same crop. Field to market, so one thing we've worked on with our contractors is making sure we're holding the IP for the metrics and technologies by which they're used. With the exception, we have an MOU with NRCS. We do use some of their tools that are in the public domain, but otherwise we're owners of the metrics and technologies that we use. And then finally, I wanted to end just in talking about potential avenues for collaboration, or where we're actively reaching out for more collaboration in the scientific community in particular. And so really the one that's most on my mind as the science and research director and as facilitator for our metrics work group is really being true to this science-based objective and bringing in outside experts where we can to contribute to development, as well as to do review of our metrics, as well as those verification guidelines that are under development. So I think this is really important. The conservation sector within field to market also is very engaged in making sure that we're following this particular priority or tenet of our guidelines. And so that's one area where I am going to be reaching out more and more into the scientific community and my contacts and trying to build support for that. And quite frankly, building a budget so that that's something that I can reach out and help encourage outside experts to come work with us. Again, metric testing, one of the things we need to be establishing is sample fields to test and pilot changes in our metrics. And my goal there is to have not just some of the fields that are within our projects, so private producer fields, but also to reach out and get some information, basic data from things like experimental fields within land-grant universities or other research fields that have a large and long history of information that we can potentially use as well for that testing. One area that we're discovering that we need more expertise and input on is sort of spatial extrapolation geostatistics. So how can people use results from a specific region or project to characterize a larger area or the supply of a particular commodity? And I think what we really offer to people who want to collaborate with us is really getting into this supply chain, this full supply chain engagement that we have, where we've got communication flowing both ways, all the way through the chain that includes the producers for these commodity crops. And these are, there's a huge amount of acreage in the country that's engaged in this type of production. And a lot of the sustainability message so far hasn't necessarily reached into that particular population, and it's starting to. So what we're able to do through these supply chain projects is reach out and pull in this large group of producers who haven't necessarily been engaged in this, and they haven't been thinking about it in the way that some of the early adopters might have been, or some of the specialty crop producers may have been. And so really, a lot of it is starting the conversation, making people really aware of what's really critical and important to the people who are purchasing their products, not just through the supply chain, but to the eventual consumer, and trying to get communication to flow along that so there's a better understanding all the way through. And that's the end of what I had prepared. I'm happy to take any questions. I think I can turn this back over.
Yeah, stop screen sharing at the top.
There we go. Okay.
There we go. Okay.
So I don't know if you have questions, Dorn, or if there are others online who.
Oh, I've got lots of questions, Allison. That was fantastic.
Great.
There's at the green bar at the top there, you hit stop.
Okay.
Yep.
Otherwise, I'm just showing you. Okay.
Yeah. Allison, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. I've got pages of notes for questions, but we only have about 15 minutes for it. So I wanted to come back to your collaborations slide, because that's a very rich list of ways in which people can, organizations, a number of whom have been participating here, could reach out. And I guess I'd like to focus specifically, a lot of our audience have been both folks on the producer side and then also folks who are more on the academic and model side. And I see tremendous value in a lot of the data that you're going to be collecting. And you mentioned an API for integrating into farmer systems, but just maybe talk a little bit about the kind of process that you imagine for engaging with folks like, the other environmental modelers or other folks who are running climate models with different outcomes rather than consumer-faced, more environmental-facing, and also who are asking general, doing more direct research, but which this data will clearly inform. So I guess it's just sort of how do you, and that's, I'll just leave it at that and see where you go with it.
No, that's a good question. And I, coming from a research background, would love to see that, because the more I get involved in this particular private sector world, and particularly there's a large number of companies out there right now doing ag technology in the private sector. And they have all sorts of really fantastic tools to aggregate information and report out. And it's all really held in the private sector. And so thinking about how that could be really useful to inform model development or other research, I think, I would really like to see that happen. I'm not, I think since we're still, we're a nonprofit, but we're also a multi-stakeholder alliance of a lot of private partners. And so the governance of our data is not entirely up to, staff. It's not entirely up to us here, but it has to go through, kind of board approval. At the same time, we do have this national report that I didn't go into a lot. But really, it's so far what that's really done is mine USDA statistics and data. But what we'd like to do when we're able to bring in our information from the projects, and there's enough of that to be able to look at aggregate performance and statistics and how what we've done has influenced that in certain areas, but be able to report on some of that in the national report. So to have that in a publication. We work with, I think, the way we've worked most closely with researchers so far has really been through membership. And it's what we've really engaged universities so far is through extension programs. And one of my hopes is that we're able to reach past just the extension programs and bring in, a broader suite of university partners who are doing active research in the fields in addition to working directly with the producers. So I would like to see more of that. I don't have a vision right now for how I can make that happen. We can't, it's going to be difficult for us to just start handing out data. But if there are people who want to work with us or have tools that they think would be really useful for us, I'm sort of on the lookout for those as well, areas where we can bring in tools that have been developed elsewhere and adapt them to our purposes. And work with, if they're interested developers, work with them on developing them further for us.
I think this brings up the other point on the producer side, as far as I think it's great that you have right up front that producers own their own data, but it is this privacy versus collaborative event, this network effect where you get more value when you share it.
Yes.
So I see that one of the really exciting conversations that this group can, I think, have is developing license and use agreements for that data.
Yeah.
That at the farmer level, it can flow through to you, but then also, and I think as far as the presentation so far, the kind of social feedback mechanisms that you're working on, as far as your spider charts, your histograms comparing everybody, your operation to everybody else. It's exactly the way the exciting thing I think that we can be doing more of, which leads me to my next question around I've got to look at my notes again. I think it's exciting that you already have built in a release process for new metrics, and assuming that you will be updating those indicators. I think in addition to these use agreements at the producer end, I think there's also this process of integrating in new metrics that go beyond, again, what each of our individual processes are, but allow the farmer. I think this is the power of this conversation is the farmer is interested in the metrics you're producing, but allow them to also reach out to other tools and analyze in a whole bunch of other ways too for decision support.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, and that's kind of one of the issues that we've talked actually a lot with NRCS about, because a lot of these same producers are having to report, they're enrolled in various conservation programs and they have to report a variety of ways back to NRCS, and they would really like to have some sort of common way that they can collect the information and then spit out different reports. And so that's something we've certainly talked with NRCS about, and making it, easy on them to be able to use their information in multiple ways, reporting to us, reporting to NRCS, reporting to other programs that might be interested in the outcome. So yeah, and it's all in the technology. I think the capabilities are there. It's finding the right development of that process. But that's definitely the way it's going. We're really being pushed to move in that direction.
So right now, your indicator process for accepting new indicators is through your work groups and advisory process. Is that correct?
Right. So right now the process is so we've set this up recently so that it's more formal. But then any member can recommend a revision or a new metric. And so the work group makes a decision on that, but then it also gets voted on by our board of directors. So they will handle any more political considerations or strategic considerations with regard to those metrics. But the metrics group will handle sort of the technical process of development, ensuring that development is robust and watching over that, and then conducting a review process and so on and so forth. But it does get that additional level of scrutiny from the board, and it does have to be, at this point, member suggested. So coming through somebody in our membership to get added in.
Yeah, I would be interested to see as more of these initiatives overlap nationally, sort of how that process scales and looks at more regional specific metrics that might layer on, or as you mentioned, I thought it was very exciting how you outlined one of the collaborative aspects was field testing and verification on an ongoing basis for these metrics.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And so we're trying to make that more robust as well, because I think that's not been, a lot of the metrics that we're using, or several of them are coming through NRCS. And so they've obviously conducted their own set of trials and evaluations and things like that, and they're well known and in the public domain. But I think sort of stronger verification and tracing, and also, if we're looking at continuous improvement, right, we have growers who've been entering information and they have their benchmarks. And then if we change the metric on them halfway through, they have to have some way to be able to connect the old results to the new results, right? So we have to do enough of an evaluation to make that connection so they can, see, still look for continuous improvement or look for their benchmark over a longer period of time, even if some of the metrics are updated with new information over time. Right. So, to my mind, having sort of test farms that are, really well known, that's why I'm looking at kind of experimental farms that have decades of information and research on, so they're really well understood and there's a lot of data. That type of resource, I think, can be useful in that process. So we're looking into that more with our university partners.
And of course, this the process you mentioned also allows for new metrics as we have more measurements coming online with both remote sensing and improved, greater amounts of data being collected through things like the soil health initiatives that are just getting started.
Right, and so that's a big one right now. As our membership is very interested in soil health, they actually, made a big statement last fall about how that was a critical area they wanted to consider a metric in. But, as the research right now is not there to support broad scale models of soil health based on just the type of information we collect from producers. So we're working we're going to write a white paper about soil health. We're staying engaged with the Soil Renaissance and the Soil Health Partnership, which is some of our members, doing that as well. So we're, for issues like that, where we know it's really important, but it's not yet ready for a metric in the scale that we need, we plan to stay engaged and work with those initiatives in any way we can to lead towards an eventual metric. So our goal is to be able to bring that in when the science supports it, because it's definitely one of big interest for a lot of our members. And because it affects, it really cuts all of the other concerns that we have in terms of water quality and greenhouse gas emissions, and most of the other metrics tie in some way to soil health. If we're able to build a metric there, I think it would be incredibly valuable to the process.
So, and do you see the tools that you're developing for feedback to the farmers? We have the benchmarking, and you're doing, relating to your neighbors. Do you see that moving towards a soil health management planning, decision support tools that crop advisors or farmers themselves might use, or is it on your radar screen to partner with other folks to bring that kind of vision together?
Good question, because we don't have a really formal way right now. It's really within each individual project that they share information with one another and with their advisors, but there's not a formal way that aggregates that back up. We do it sort of an informal top-down way where we say, okay, we're looking at our water quality tool, please provide feedback on what is and isn't working in the projects where you've looked into that particular metric, and so we do it in those ways, but it hasn't been a really coordinated, explicit effort in that sense. But I think that's an opportunity if there are issues where that would be useful, it's something that we can reach out to. The projects do operate often independently, so there is a little bit of a central node, but it's a very loose central node. So there's one staff person who really is the contact for all of them, and this is why we're trying to establish better sort of reporting protocols, so it's more standardized. But right now it's a little bit too loose to do that. But it would be a useful way to, I think, to make better use of that sort of wealth of data that could be mined from those groups.
And you mentioned right now there is an API for the growers to be able to access their own data, or that's the intention?
No, right now everything's done through the web interface mostly. There is an API being piloted, so there's a couple of the member companies who've installed the metrics essentially into the platforms they already have that they work with producers on, and so those are being tested. But and I think it'll really be fully implemented as we move to this next version of the calculator. Really, a goal of it is we still will have this free online tool. That's important for purposes of transparency and openness and all of that. But I think most of the projects will probably be using an interface on one of these other technologies for their primary way to run the metrics as we go forward. It's still in development, though.
Right. Well, there's a lot of rich follow-up conversations that I'm excited to have as we start to bring a number of the folks who have been presenting here over the last number of weeks together.
Great.
Do you have any other things that you'd like to close with at the end here? I felt that you really addressed within your presentation the two main questions as far as how collaboration, what your barriers are and how collaboration might help, and the links to regenerative agriculture.
Yeah. And I would like to continue these kinds of conversations. I'm still coming up to speed on all of this and understanding what the opportunities and the limitations are. And to me, just personally, the motivation, just I guess to close on, is that we're engaging commodity crops production on a very large scale. And so we're not necessarily looking to transform agriculture overnight into regenerative agriculture. But I think the opportunity is even a small change in the right direction, engaging the large area that we have and the very large scope of commodity crop production. Even a small change in that direction can have a huge effect environmentally. And so that, to me, is part of the power of this particular approach and one of the ways to look at it, to me. It may not be going as far as some of the early adopters of really transformative regenerative techniques, but it can still, it will still have a very large influence, and moving us in that direction incrementally is, I think, very powerful.
Well, and I think that's an important point from this group's perspective, is that our objective is to be gathering data on those regenerative practices and being able to fill in those models and be science-based, and then bring it through a system like this to compare. So that we're showing up on those histograms and those spider charts and so forth, finding those bright spots so that they show up. And we're looking at that continuum. Moving towards the kinds of scale that you're talking about. So I think it's a really important piece of the conversation to bring in both the consumer facing and then also this question of scale. And the influence, as you said, of just some small changes. And that social aspect of having data, this social based system with real data.
We'll try. Great.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, Allison. I think it's been a great pleasure, and look forward to more conversations coming. Next week, before I forget, we'll have Peter Bick with Arizona State University and Carbon Nation. He'll be joining us, and really looking forward to that dialogue as well. So, thanks so much, and hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much.